Okay, we are at the happy hour with me. I am Eileen Cook, and today is November 20th. I have no idea how that happened. And we are starting off with a question this morning. So Bonnie had a question about length. So she's been talking to Crystal, who's been mentioning the concept of writing shorter. So Bonnie, go ahead and share your thoughts.
Yeah, so Crystal has me considering writing in a much shorter length to produce like a series that has, so I can have some more content to sell, so I can gather readership. That's the main point of it. And she mentioned 10,000 words, and I just wanted to talk about that as a real number. Like, is that really not realistic? Like 20,000, or what that would look like? And also specifically things to keep in mind when writing shorter like that, because it feels both exciting as something to try and a little bit worrisome to me.
Worrisome. I find that an interesting choice of words. What about it is worrisome?
Well, I have to just, the original, I'm sorry, I'm stuttering here. When I wrote the original version of the middle grade novel that I'm trying to sell, it was very, very short and specifically attached to a doll that somebody was making, much like in the American Doll version.
Okay.
And before I gave it away, I gave it to them, I shopped it around a little bit. And it was obviously way too short, and I think probably a little more didactic, and it was not as good. And so, and I don't really know how, I seem not to be very successful at breaking down the formula of what would be considered like an American Girl novel, book, whatever you want to call it, novella. So sometimes it helps to hear it from someone else instead of trying to figure it out on my own.
Fair enough. Well, I have an opinion, and I will also encourage people in the chat window. Bonnie's laughing. She's like, of course, Eileen has an opinion. So I'm going to encourage people to chime into the chat window if they like, in terms of their thoughts. So I do have a couple of things I'd like to kind of talk about with that. So the first and probably most important is, what's your goal with the story? So writing short has a couple of different options. Writing short can be a very big challenge if you're trying to do it traditionally published wise. And that's just because the cost of them to produce that book. So something like the American Girls book, they're producing and packaging often with the dolls, versus having it on the bookshelf where they're trying to sell it to Barnes and Noble or Indigo or something like that. So primarily, a lot of times what you'll see shorts with, and it works particularly well a lot in the romance world. I don't know if anyone in here is writing romance, but people who do write romance find that they have such voracious readers and they love those kinds of things. So they will download and be very interested in shorts. I have not seen as many people, middle grade readers, reading electronically. So that just gives me a question around viability of what you do with that story. Having said that, I don't think that necessarily gets you, like, you have a couple options. So one is that it's some kind of giveaway, excuse me, that you are passing that on, on your website, or making it available where people could download it and read it, or a teacher could pass it along. So you might send it out to teachers and say, I have this free middle grade short that your students might enjoy. Please enjoy it. I think you'd have a more difficult time if your goal is selling that middle grade short. So before I go further, go ahead, Bonnie. Yeah.
So yes. So I guess the sort of strategy, and it is coming from romance, is that it would be self-published, first of all. Yes. And that the first one might be free, but then and then the others would cost money. But I understand what you're saying. If middle graders aren't reading electronically, then even a free one isn't going to be that useful or inspiring.
And it may be changing. And that's just where I see, and I think it's a fascinating thing, is in terms of online reading, my biggest suspicion when ebooks took off, and I'm actually old enough to remember when ebooks took off, is that you would see teens be the ones who would be the biggest embracers of that technology. because they're already on their phones, they're already so digitally connected, that teens would be the ones who would be the most voracious consumers of ebooks. And that has actually not panned out. You actually see, one, a lot of seniors really embracing ebooks. And I think part of that is you can, and I say this as someone who's turning 50 this year, you can change the font size on that bad boy, and I can actually read an ebook in bed without having to put on reading glasses, which I love. And of course, miserable little kids don't have that problem, so they're not worried about it. And font size hasn't taken off. So whether or not that continues to evolve, I do think there is definitely a marketing approach, and I have seen it work over and over again with people, where if they are doing some kind of giveaway, what they find is that giving away a book initially and then having books that come after that that have a cost to it is definitely much more successful than trying to charge all the way across for those books. For you, I really wonder if the focus becomes around trying to gain teachers as readers, and then getting them to then encourage or sell the book, or to use a short that would be provided to them as some kind of gateway. And I know you've been working a lot on, what's the word I'm looking for, teachers' guides and lesson guides that would sort of go. So I'm not sure if anyone else is writing middle grade or YA, but certainly one thing to keep in mind if you are is that teachers and librarians are huge gatekeepers. Obviously, the older they get, the more likely that teens are going to be purchasing their own books, so they're not necessarily, relying on someone else. But at the middle grade age, they probably are, unless they've been given a gift card. Someone is buying that book for them. So that person who buys the book, whether that's a librarian or a parent or a, wonderful kind aunt, that person has sort of the sway around what buying decision gets made. So, whether or not you can influence them becomes a key component. So I would say in terms of and we're going to break this down into two parts, Bonnie, so stick with me. So in terms of the question around marketability, I have still some reservations about how marketable online middle grade is. And I am not sure if anyone else has had any experience or seen anything with that, but I haven't seen, I don't think, a big middle grade breakout that's been an indie published one. There has been some YA that has broken out as indie, but I'm not sure as much about middle grade. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd love to see it in the chat window or comments about that. Bonnie, I was going to go back to you. Also had questions about, was it about how do you tackle or write that length? There was a two-part to this question. I know there was.
If I was going to do it, sort of what to keep in mind when going shorter, in terms of the craft of it, what the focus, where you're putting your focus, or what are any tricks. I know you don't write short necessarily at all, but maybe you have some ideas about that.
As a matter of fact, I do. Everyone who knows me is laughing out loud. Eileen has an opinion. All right. So a couple things to keep in mind when writing short is, one, just in the same way of writing anything, my biggest encouragement for people is read as much as you can that would be similar to what you're wanting to write. I think part of that is we just, at an instinctive level, start to understand how the form works when we read it that way. So if you can get a collection of shorter pieces that are middle grade pieces, that would be a great place to start to sort of see how they have structured that. The biggest thing to keep in mind, of course, is that you just have less room and space to deal with. So depending on the amount of subplots or various things that you wanted to put in there, you're going to have to trim and cut some of that out because there simply isn't going to be space. So you're going to be looking at how to identify a specific thing that can be covered in the amount of time and space that I have and still feels really rich and satisfying to the person so that they feel like they got a good read for that. And I'll put a plug in for Crystal. Like, I would encourage people to check out some of her novellas. Again, even though they're romance, I think having that chance to see how she's covering a romance, particularly if you have ever read a full-length romance novel, like what she's choosing to sort of narrow in and sort of specifically tackle will be really key. So first off, read as much as you can in that area. The second thing is just to play with it and try it. People know I have a little bit of a bias. I think we have tendencies as a writer. So the one that obviously we hear about all the time is you're a plotter or a pantser. You're either someone who likes to outline before you write a story, or you're the person who likes to write by the seat of your pants. The other one that I tend to use a lot is I talk about people who write short versus long. And when I'm using that term, what I'm actually talking about is when I do a rough draft, it's quite short. So my completed novels tend to be about 75 to 85,000 words, but my drafts tend to be much more like 55 to 65,000 words. So for me, when I'm doing multiple drafts, what I'm usually doing is layering in other things. So I just think in a really streamlined fashion. Other people do what we call writing long, which is for their 85,000 word novel, they write 120,000 words and then have to bushwhack the heck out of that to trim out all the stuff that doesn't need to be there. So again, I think people have a tendency which way they tend to lean. And I also think using both short and long in a different way, I think we have a comfort zone that is one way or the other. I definitely lean towards writing longer fiction. I don't know if that's because I just can't shut up, which is distinctly possible, or whether or not it is a case of just I read much more long fiction. So for me, compelling a story into that area and space feels really good for me. So I think one of the ways to figure out how well you're going to do with it is to just actually settle in and trying to do it. And then the last thing that I think you're going to have to look at is where do you put your focus? And here I'm going to sort of divide between adult and middle grade. And I'm also going to start with saying this is my opinion and bias. So if someone wants to disagree with me, feel free. I think if you are writing middle grade and you're going to do shorter, you're going to want to make sure that you're focusing to a large degree on what is happening. That is that you're going to want to have much more of a plot-driven kind of piece. If you're writing adult, I think you can go either. You can have either plot or what I would consider character or an emotionally driven piece. And certainly most of us have read a short story that is almost completely 100% internal, is very, sort of thought-focused and all those kinds of things. And you're not necessarily, I think, going to see that as much in middle grade short. That's my suspicion and bias. So I would be looking at, for example, Bonnie, if there was something where it's like, well, I'm going to cut out this particular scene that has some good dialogue or some kind of action doesn't have to be things blowing up. So I don't want to imply that action means, an asteroid's crashing into the earth and the person has to do something about it. I think it can be much smaller than that, but I do want to sort of put the plug in that the idea is something is happening that we can sort of have a chance to see that interaction. So where does that leave you thinking and feeling, Bonnie?
Well, I definitely have some thinking to do about this because, I think you've made some excellent points about why it might not be a good idea, but doesn't mean I'm gonna think about it and maybe play with one and just. But I think you're right. It has to be more action, and it's interesting because I think my tendency is to write the other way. But this might be a good way to practice doing something different. And I guess, like you said, you just have to do it. I can't really think it through enough to decide whether or not to do it. It's probably just something to try.
I keep hoping in my lifetime that I'm someday going to figure out how to do this stuff without having to actually do all the work that is involved. And I have yet to have that success. And whenever I hear people say, well, I'm going to do that because I hear it works really well and it's just going to be this thing, I always think, well, I hope so. But it's often, of course, way more complicated than it seems to be. So I definitely don't want to discourage you, because I think our market, anyone obviously who's in writing and publishing these days knows everything is changing, and it's changing so quickly that as soon as you think you've got it figured out what works, then it changes up and it's completely different again. And I think the indie market is just growing by leaps and bounds, and there's so much exciting stuff happening on the indie side. And I think what I have seen a little bit on traditional, where they have embraced the short, is where they're asking authors to potentially do some kind of free, like after the ending, or here's the prequel, kind of a free novella or short story that can be a download that one can sometimes buy readers' attention and catch their attention in between publishing dates, because most traditional publishing is still primarily on a year-long schedule. That is, you'll probably have a book come out once a year. They do have some schedules that are sped up, but in general, they're still doing about a book a year as kind of the standard. And they're looking over at indie people who are having obviously way more material coming out. And they're seeing that readers are engaged in that. Readers are wanting that material. They're wanting to check in. Particularly if you have a series. It's that kind of thing, like, I want to know what my friends are doing. And I don't want to wait for the yearly Christmas letter. I want to check in on Facebook every so often and see what's happening. So I think you're seeing in traditional where they are using shorts, novellas, short stories as bridges between kind of traditional publication dates. And if we see that being successful, I think you're just going to see more and more of it, particularly if you're doing a series. If you're not doing a series, it's sometimes a little bit more tricky around what kind of content am I providing that can do that. And you're seeing sometimes people do things like, let me show you some missing scenes, so scenes that I cut out of a draft. And so I'm putting those up as kind of a freebie that someone might want to engage with to sort of have that interaction. Or here's something set in that same world, or a little side story off my novel, but it's not necessarily bridging to my next project, because my next project is another new standalone book that you know nothing about. So that becomes something to think about.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things we were also talking about is looking at what you already have. So I think what I'll probably start with is a manuscript that I have that I had abandoned for various reasons. The tricky thing for me in my series concept is that it's not going to be a character that repeats. Yeah. It's more of a series of like feisty middle grade Jewish girls in different parts of the world with interesting situations that come from being Jewish and and living in the time and place that they lived. So I won't have a character that somebody wants to follow, but I do think having the first page or two of the next one at the back of the first one is probably a good way of maybe tickling interest.
Yes, and I think, again, a market for you is going to be around teachers and educators, because I can see, that going for in terms of, well, obviously, if there's any kind of Jewish school or educational thing where it's like, this is a resource that I want to have for my students. But I certainly don't think that you have to be Jewish to enjoy those stories and to have sort of a narration around these are strong young women, regardless of their faith, who happen to have these interesting stories that are telling. And when we kind of looked at some of your teacher guidebooks and so forth, there was a lot of things around how someone could maybe make that bridge between I'm Catholic or Muslim or atheist, but what are the things that I see in that story that resonated with me that I want to, as a shared value, or, as an opportunity to see another voice or another perspective. So, one of the places that I can see the free being really beneficial for you, Bonnie, is having packaged together, here is a short story or a short novella, and then here are some curriculum guides or writing prompts or things that a teacher could use. And again, then marketing that out to educators who are looking for content. And I don't think anyone on here is a teacher.
I was.
Yeah. So you would, maybe you can speak to this, Bonnie, but I certainly know the people that I do know that are instructors, like that's often what they're doing is they're trying to find content. And And sometimes it's even just to have content at the ready if you're ever sick. So if you've, again, ever been a teacher and you're a substitute, you want to have that content ready. So my overall summary with this is, I would say, I think writing shorts is going to be a very interesting market, and both in traditional and indie, but it's certainly much stronger at this point in indie. It's certainly working particularly well, I think, at the adult or kind of upper YA market. And even with the upper YA market, I don't see it as strong as I see in the adult market, particularly in romance. Those romance readers, one thing I absolutely love about them is they are voracious, man. Those people, like, they are book, I don't know, ferrets. Like, they just can't get enough of it, the content. And they buy it, they read it, they share it with friends. And I just haven't seen quite the same amount. Natasha is sharing Reindeer Games, which is Crystal's newest.
Speaking of short, it's very short. It's the absolutely cutest little book. 2 to 3 hours read, and it was fabulous. It was I was like a little holiday. And in fact, I cursed Crystal because I went to go get some eggnog, and then I realized they don't have any right now. And so I sent her a little spicy note about eggnog.
Yes. The book should come with eggnog. Now I have to put a thing. Did you open the book and see who it's dedicated to?
Someone named Eileen.
So yeah, I'm a little biased on that one. I'm like, she picked my favorite one. So one of the questions in the chat window is like, is there a word counts for shorts? So I think part of the question is, if you're thinking about writing shorts, is again, what is the purpose that I'm trying to do with it? So Natasha, if you can hold up Crystal's book one more time. Crystal has made these available in sort of 3 different formats. So Crystal has looked at audiobooks. So I think all of hers are now available as an audio. She does do print copies, and turn it to the side so we can see the spine. It's a little tiny little book, and it's kind of pocket-sized. If people remember Harlequin novels or things like that, it's kind of, she's going to do a nice little comparison to it.
Yeah, here's a random Harlequin, right?
Yeah.
So it's very close. It's just a tiny bit smaller. It's just a very tiny bit. It's not quite as wide, and it's a little bit shorter. And it's in terms of the thickness. And that's one of my comments for Crystal was the weight of this book is really comfortable in the hand. Yeah. So if it's just a beautiful size, and it's got good tactile feel, which is really nice.
How many words or pages is it?
Yeah.
I think hers are about 30,000, between 20 to 30,000 are her print.
So in this size, it comes out at 245 pages, probably about 250 with all the, so she probably sized it this size because, so it would feel like it was substantial. She has a little bit of history in the publishing industry. I don't know exactly how much, but quite enough to know what she's doing here.
Yeah. The reason that traditional publishers have steered away is if you look at a book that's kind of traditionally sized, if you did it, so like in the average size paperback, if you did it at 25 to 30,000 words, which is about what Crystal's books come in at, you'd be looking at a very thin book, and there's that perception of value, right? So it's that weird thing around people feeling like, well, if I'm buying that, then I want it to look. And with books, we like them to look a little hefty. So many things in life, we don't like that. My butt, for example, we're not so crazy about the hefty there. But in a book, we kind of like a little bit of heft because we want to feel like we're getting our monies out of it, right? So I want words for that money. And the size, so Crystal's size is a non-standardized size. Like that's not a size that you're typically going to see in a bookstore. Again, when you're indie publishing, you can kind of have a little bit more look at that. So they're looking at shipping costs. They're looking at various kinds of things. And
actually, one of the things with this is that Crystal, like here's a Nancy Warren Blaze. She used to be a member of our chapter. And this is a Harlequin. And for shipping purposes, they have like pulp, literally pulp paper. It's quite light. Her book, Crystal's book, which is smaller, weighs more. She chose a really nice quality paper. So it feels substantial. So I'm really surprised, to be honest with you, to find out that it could be 30,000 words. I know it must have been because I read it so quickly, but but it does not feel like 30,000 words. So this is very well done.
Because Blaze Harlequin, correct me if I'm wrong, is about 50,000, 55?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to kind of give you an idea again of what we're talking about is packaging at this point, right? We're talking about how do we make that look? But again, if you're writing short, so if you're writing something around 20 to 30,000 words, and you're thinking that you want to create a print version of that, you're thinking about then how do you make that, and I would defer 100% in this case to Crystal, like how do you make that feel like a substantial book for someone? If it's an ebook, obviously people are less concerned about kind of the heft and all that kind of stuff. They know what they're getting, and there's a large desire, and Amazon's done a lot of work at looking at people who are sometimes looking for like, what's a book I could read in sort of 2 to 4 hours, versus other people who are like, no, I want a book that's going to consume me, for 10, 20, 30 hours. So I'm looking for that giant, hefty fantasy novel that's, a book stop kind of book. So that's kind of different. Sometimes reader preferences, what they're looking for.
And that's one of the things that I worry about with going short is, but I also think about for middle grade, those reluctant readers, you know, for whom a shorter book is going to feel less intimidating.
Right.
And I think a really good place to look at an example of that, I don't know how many people are familiar with Orca Publishing. Orca Publishing is a BC publisher. They're based out of Vancouver Island. And one of their specialties is working with reluctant readers. And a lot of their books, if you pick them up and take a look at them, they're definitely a little bit smaller. They're a little bit thinner. Even just the space on the page, they're laid out in a way where there's a little bit more white space, where kids who might be slower readers are still going to find that they're flipping pages and not feeling like they're getting stuck. I've been on this page forever. And it's sometimes also just easier to read. If you're talking about reluctant readers, there's a whole bunch of reasons people might be reluctant readers. So sometimes is vocabulary. So Orca uses the term, and I'm going to screw it up, but it's lots of story, low vocabulary. They have a term that's way more eloquent than what I just spit out. But the whole idea is you're not writing down a story. Like Orca's looking primarily at YA, so they're still tackling the same topics that you would see in a YA that might be a little bit heftier. So anything from date rape to, whether or not you have a date for the dance, depending obviously on what they're doing, but they're still high action, high story, just the vocabulary reads at a much lower level. So I think thinking about how you're going to use it, how you're going to package it, how you're going to distribute it is all going to make a difference. Oh, thank you, Jean. High content, low vocab. See, it was way more eloquent than what I was trying to make it. So Orca is a really good example to look at how they're doing that and how they're packaging that. Another option, Bonnie, to look at would be where you would do kind of, for lack of a better term, almost like a book set. So again, Crystal has done up some of these where you can buy her books in groups. So there's the Silver Bells series and all these kinds of things. So whether or not you're like, I have a set, so here's a book of 4 of these shorter books, and you could potentially have them all as one. Go ahead, Natasha.
I have another example of another member of our writers group, Susan Lyons. She writes romance. And she writes from sweet to spicy. So these are her sweet ones. These are 12 short stories, and they're very thin. It's very light, and it's a nice collection. Like if you write short, you can. It just happens to her theme was calendar, so there are 12. But whatever theme you choose, you can make something up. And this is not a thick book, but it feels friendly. And I mean, when it's digital, it doesn't really matter. But it's still like if you write short, you can group it together any way you want.
And that would be another option for you to think about, Bonnie, where they're available as an ebook download, or they're available as a print download, and there's 4 of them grouped together or 3 of them grouped together that might make more of a heftier print book, because I do think with middle grade, you're going to see more print than ebook. I might be wrong on that, but at least unless anyone wants to chime in, I am not seeing a ton of middle grade ebook readers. And in fact, hang on one second. I'm going to actually, use that inner tubes thing that we have and see what I can find. So we were going to do a blue pencil today, but I got an email. The person we were blue penciling can't make it. So that is why we are not doing that. Hold on, I am pulling up actual content. Not to scare anyone. But here's an interesting article that I can't vouch for because I am just looking at it now, but it's talking about the market for middle grade as self-publishing. And her opening line is, I often say indie middle grade doesn't sell. But then she has actually some sort of things to look at, and she actually has some examples. So I think that would be really interesting.
Would you put the link in the chat, please?
Yep, the link is there in the chat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I think that would be interesting to sort of see. She has apparently one writers group that's doing it, and she's talking about how they've made it work. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to kind of distill down on. For people who are writing outside of middle grade, I think the big question with writing short comes down to a couple of things. So first is, do you actually want to do it? So some people I know love writing short because it has this wonderful thing of you actually can finish it in a shorter period of time. And in fact, if people are struggling sometimes to write longer projects, I really encourage them to try writing short, because you get the experience of writing a beginning, a middle, and an end, and seeing a story come together, and you can revise it and make it better, which is the whole point of what we're trying to do. But if you are someone who you discover, like, I actually don't enjoy writing short, I would much prefer to write a longer project, you don't have to. But where you may want to consider it is around the marketability. And in terms of publishing, we are looking for some kind of reader engagement. Again, whether you're traditional or indie, like, how do you keep yourself kind of front and center? I know for myself, it's something I have not traditionally done. And I actually had a talk with my publisher about, like, so I have a book coming out in March. Should I have some kind of free ebook giveaway that kind of sets up the story or is a little bit of a prequel? And actually they ended up coming back saying that when they had done it, they hadn't seen a lot of success with that, but they had seen more success with doing a bonus chapter or something out of one of my previous books. So for me, that I might do something like What Happened in With Malice, or a chapter from the main character, and that is Jill, but if you want to call her the antagonist, the villain is a girl named Simone. So having, a few things from Simone, because people have already engaged with that, so they are then intrigued to want to see a little bit more. But because the new book they haven't yet engaged with, and it's not a part of a series, that there's not necessarily the same pull. So the idea would be like to write some kind of additional thing for With Malice, and then have maybe a few opening, as you talked about, Bonnie, like maybe a bit of the first chapter or the first few pages in the back of that book. And traditional publishing has done that for a long time. When you see paperback versions come out, so for example, my book, The Hanging Girl, is going to be coming out in paperback here pretty soon, and it will have in the back of it the opening chapter to You Owe Me a Murder. And 100% what we're hoping, obviously, is that someone who hadn't yet read The Hanging Girl or loved it so much they had to own it paperback too, God bless you, then that person would, be like, oh, I didn't know she had a new book, and instantly click upon it and rush out to see if they can then, get that book as well. So that is definitely something that can be a possibility that would work in terms of that marketing side of things. Other questions on shorts? Bye, Bonnie. Nice to have you. She's dashing off. All right. So I'm going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to talk this evening about motivation because I'm just doing a little bit of some work on my own thing around motivation. And it just brought up for me thinking about goals. So I'm going to do just a little bit of talking about that goal kind of thing. And so where that's useful. So again, come back in at 5 o'clock tonight if you want to talk about motivation. But you can't really talk about motivation without talking about what are they motivated for. And that motivated for obviously is the goal. And I have used the term before that I often think of the goal as the destination. There is a book by John Truby, which I'm forgetting the name of it, and I will find it for you. But John Truby does a thing about a destination. So he talks about the goal is kind of the ticket that you've sold to the reader. So if a book is a train trip, if you say London, that's where the person expects to end up at the end of the train trip, that they will be in London, right? So the goal is the destination that the reader is going to. This is a book about a character who wants to save the dragons. This is a book about a character who wants to solve this murder. This is a book about a character who wants to find true love. And the book is over when the character either obtains that goal, which is usually kind of a happy ending, or fails in some way, shape, or form with that goal, which is sort of a sad ending. But the goal is something, and I'm becoming more and more convinced about this. I don't believe in absolutes, but this one is leaning more and more absolutely. Thank you, Natasha. I love people who Google while I chat. I am becoming more and more convinced that the character must know the goal. And we'll talk tonight around motivation. They may not necessarily know the motivation for it, but they have to know what it is that they're striving for. Otherwise, I think you run the risk of they just have no agency. Having said that, doesn't have to be a good goal. The reader might be cheering that they don't get that goal, that what they're trying to do is, they want to murder someone, for example. They may not have a good goal, but it should be something that they know that they are pursuing. Now, a goal can be external or internal. So obviously they could be saying, what I want is to get more self-confident. I want to believe in myself. I think the challenge with that is what I often came up with as a counselor. So someone would come in and they would say, I have terrible self-confidence. I doubt myself all the time. I really want to improve my self-confidence. And as a counselor, one of the key things, if you wanted to be successful with a client, that I learned very early on by not being successful with others, was you had to define what that actually looked like in an external kind of format. So if you were more self-confident, what would you be saying, doing that is different than what you are doing now? And the reason for having that external side of things is if you have it as an external thing, you can actually measure if you're getting closer to it or not. If you say, I want to be more self-confident, like, how do you have any idea if you're becoming more self-confident unless you become that person who's like, I'm awesome, right? Like, unless you're that person, like, how do I know that you're actually more confident? So again, when you'd have someone come in and they'd say, my marriage isn't going well, we're just not getting along, we want to get along better. The good marriage therapist is saying, what are you saying or doing that would show me that you are getting along better? Well, he would have his phone off when we had dinner and actually talk to me. We'd occasionally have sex. That'd be one. We would take vacations together. We would do, and then as a counselor, then you can start setting up specific things. As a writer, it's the exact same thing. If I want this character, they want to become more self-confident, I can set up specific things that they are then trying to achieve. So they're going to show that they're more self-confident because they are going to try out for community theater. They've always wanted to be an actress. They've, always been too terrified to get up on stage to do any kind of public speaking. So what I'm going to show is them slowly moving towards that kind of thing. So they are going to volunteer at the community theater. They're not going to try out right away, but they're going to volunteer and they're going to make some friends, and those friends are going to encourage them. And then we're going to see over the story arc that the final thing is going to be, of course, they're going to meet some dreamy guy. because Natasha's here, so we're going to make it a romance. They're going to meet some dreamy guy in this theater production as well, or dreamy girl. I'm open. Don't feel locked into that and my binary gender thing. So they're going to meet someone who's going to make them feel that, the special feels, and that person's going to encourage them and also make them want to try out. And then what we're going to do is see this final scene where, because Natasha now tells me she's writing mystery, she murders the guy who turns out to not actually be who he says he was the whole time. And she tries out for the play, and because she was successful in all those things, that we then see that she has gained in that self-confidence. The other way that this has been on my mind is one of my books with Malice is currently been adapted for, there's just been a screenplay written. And there's, we'll cross fingers that someday something will actually happen with that. But at the current moment, we at least, by gosh, by golly, have had a screenwriter who's signed on, and it's been going back and forth with a fellow at Netflix. And what's interesting is looking at how do you make stuff that was internal. So how do we show some of the things that were happening for that character that was internal dialogue and thoughts? How do you change that to something that happens on the screen? And I think that is going to be one of my new favorite exercises, and is going to be the homework that I'm going to leave people with. What, homework? No. Is I'm going to have you, first do a journal entry where you write down what is it that your character wants. And you should be able to do that in a couple sentences. Then I'm going to have you ask yourself, what would that look like on the screen? Where you couldn't have a scene where they're talking about what they want, but it would be something that you would have to show that they want. No cheating. You can't just have a dialogue scene where they tell someone what they want. I'm on to you, people. Right? So you can't just have a scene where they talk to their friend and say, oh, I really wish I could try out for the school play. I want you to have some kind of scene where I see that that is what they want. And how you're going to show that. Now, before anyone goes crazy and hates me, you don't necessarily always have to be showing that stuff. And I know we get the message all the time, show versus tell. There are going to be times where it's going to make the most sense because we are writing books. We're not writing screenplays. Screw the screenwriters. They can do it any way they want. They have to do it as a show. We don't. So you can have internal dialogue where the character is thinking about what they want. And yes, you can have dialogue scenes where they're telling someone what they want. That is acceptable. But I think there is a real benefit of trying to figure out how you would show that longing. So how you would see it on a screen. Bonnie.
I must admit, for one of my characters, it's easier to show how they're not getting what they want. Does that still work? Because
no.
In a book, I would show how they didn't get what they want, and then internally they'd be complaining about it. So it's harder to show.
So can you give us an example?
Well, like Mouse in my science fiction, she wants to be accepted for who she really is instead of hiding her personality. And more often I show her having to restrain herself. So, and people rewarding her for not being who she is.
So, and then do you have the internal beat as the longing for her?
If she could just say what she wanted and just do what she wanted and not have to conform to society and what's expected of her, so that she could, because she's smart and she kind of dumbs down her personality. So I don't know. I guess they could show that she does something smart and get admonished for it or ridiculed for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think one, you can keep what you have. Like, I don't think what you're having is wrong. So that's first off, no panic, right? So you can have that, but I might show a scene where we get to see her busting out that smarts, or we get to see her doing something, and whether or not she's admonished for it, but we see a moment where we see how that frees her up. So for example, taking a totally different example that's a little bit on the nose but easy. So we have someone who's really buttoned up and restrained and just feels like they can't be themselves, and they're out and all of a sudden like the music's on and it's just that perfect song, right? So they start busting a move and they are dancing like no one is watching, to quote a tacky tattoo that hopefully no one in this room has. So that is, they are doing that thing, and then either they just feel that joy that comes with letting go, and they think about how amazing would it be to just do that, to just have that moment, to just be able to be like that all the time. And or they get busted, so they realize that someone actually is watching. So someone across the lights are on in their living room, and they look across and they realize that someone has seen them dancing, and they suddenly feel either embarrassed or shame, or maybe they feel like, that's right, keep on watching. I remember once I was driving, and I can't sing. I shouldn't say I can't sing. I'm physically capable of singing, but no one would want to hear it. So I am a huge fan of the car song. And I have been known to really belt it in the car alone. And I was letting it rip. And I looked over, and the guy in the car next to me, because we were at the light, held out an imaginary microphone and then rolled down his window, and he had the same radio station on. So then I turned up my radio and he turned up his radio, and then we both were just letting her go. And it was fun. And it was actually like, it was just a great moment. It like made my whole day. Like we were both wailing out to Queen, strangely enough, because now there's that going on. So, it was just this kind of, so you might give your character, particularly, I know, Bonnie, you tend to write sometimes a little bit dark. Your characters have some hard times. So maybe there is this great moment where she gets to bust free, and she gets to feel that like momentary moment of like, yes, and it's lovely and it's rich, and she has that beautiful, beautiful thing. And then maybe you squash it. You can
I would squash it, yeah, because I'm kind of dark.
You can squash her. That's okay. I'm all right with that.
Okay, I think I'm kind of getting it, because I do more of the showing, the restraining and that. But yeah, I could see how showing her actually having hints of what she wants, and then I'm trying to see it on a big screen, like in a movie, and I can see that picture. You're dancing away, and the guy looks over, and then you shrivel up and hide the curtains. It's pretty obvious that you were happy dancing, and now you have to conform, and it sucks.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel good. And we see that there was that emotion and that happiness there. And part of that has to do with, people have heard me talk about change is a push and a pull. And so by that you're either pushed to change, that is where your current situation is so uncomfortable and so untenable that you absolutely must do something different, or you are pulled to change. That is, there is something so amazing and wonderful that you're willing to do that. So you have a lot of push going on, Bonnie, where she has to restrain herself, and it's uncomfortable and she doesn't like it. And possibly if she was allowed to let her smarts out, things would have a better outcome. So she's going to be, I think, pushed into like having to take on that mantle of leadership and have to take on the strength to do those things. But you can also offer kind of tiny little moments of pull, where she sees like how glorious it would be if she could do that. So the example, just to sort of explain push-pull maybe a little bit better, that I give in conferences all the time, so if you've heard it, sorry, but it works really well, is I want people to imagine that we're at the top of a really tall building. It's 110 stories. We're in New York City. I'm giving you guys a tour of New York. And you can see all of Manhattan. It's amazing. And I'm going to point out at the top of this extremely tall building that in the corner that the next building over is only about 4.5 feet away. And I would say to people like, well, how many people would like to jump from this building to that building? And smart people are going to be like, no, because we're 110 stories up. And if I don't make that jump, I'm going to fall to a very ugly and horrible death, right? So people generally won't do that. Of course, whenever I give this example to teen boys, there's always like 4 or 5 who are like, I'd do it, because they're not so bright, those teen boys. So that's the problem that you have there. But most sane people with a functioning frontal lobe that makes decisions will say, I'm not going to make that jump. But if I say to you, this building is on fire, it's already spread to the stairwells, we're up 110 stories, there's no way the fire trucks are going to reach us with ladders, you're going to burn to death if you don't make that jump. That's an example of push motivation. People will do that. They will go up in a battle scene to try and fight the evil overlord, blah, 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 if that evil overlord is about to burn down their village and everyone in it. Otherwise, they're not like, what I think I'll do is wander out into a battlefield and see if I could take on an enemy who's clearly much larger, better fortified, and has better weapons than I do. Like, smart people don't do that, right? So whenever you're asking your character to do that big risk, to take on something, people don't do those things unless we push them. That is, they absolutely must do it, or pull. So again, we're at the top of the same huge, tall building. And I say to you guys, look it over there, there's $1 million publishing contract on that rooftop. And the first person who's willing to jump over can get it. Now at that point, Natasha, who's now writing mysteries, may shove someone across the thing and give it a go. Someone else, like all of a sudden people start thinking like, that's, yeah, it's a huge risk, but it's $1 million publishing contract and it's only 4.5 feet. And, if I back up and I kicked ass in track in high school, like, I'm pretty sure I could do that. People will suddenly want to do that, right? So that becomes that idea that it's so desirable that they will make the go for that. Pretty much the push is almost always negative. So that's the idea that I cannot stay in my current situation. And if there's something good, then that's the pull. Like, I really want that thing. So this is the kind of thing, again, if we were writing just a very sweet, simple romance where we have the person who's like, I've been hurt before. I don't trust anyone. Men are evil and bad. I don't like them. And then they see the cute, dreamy baker across the street who's opened a new business. And, they start talking to him and they start feeling that pull, right? Like, he's really hot. He's really attractive. It would be amazing to be in a relation. What would it be like to be in a loving, and he has cookies. Excellent point, Natasha. The man can cook, right? So all of a sudden it becomes that thing where even though it is scary, even though it's 110 stories up emotionally, I am willing to make that jump. It doesn't have to be push or pull. It can be push and pull. So it can be that idea that there's something not great about where I am. So I'm sick of being lonely. I'm sick of going to sleep at night. And he has cookies. Like, now it's that kind of thing where both of those forces are working towards. So I'm being pushed and someone is pulling me from the other side. So it's that idea of both of those things coming together. Of course you can ask a question, Leslie.
Well, I keep unmuting myself to talk and then I don't talk and then I forget to unmute myself. I'm sorry. So, I have a question about this story because I did that. I wrote a journal entry for everybody to figure out what they wanted. And one of the main protagonists is a ghost. And I'm a little confused with this because what he wants is he wants to, first of all, to figure out why he's still here, why he didn't move on. Then he thinks he wants, what his job is to take care of his wife and make sure she'll be okay. So she has a friendship with this guy, and so he decides, okay, well, I must be here to make sure those two get together, and then I know she'll be taken care of. But of course, it's his wife and another man. So would that be an example of he's pushed to take care of her, and that probably means this, but at the same time, he doesn't want to do that? Like, it's hard because he doesn't really want to do that?
Yeah, you're getting into motivation. Okay. Which is fine. Totally good. No. It's good. You're making a nice little transition for me for this evening. So we will tackle part of that tonight. But what I can say is you're bringing up a really good point that wants can change and evolve over the course of the book. So an example I often give is the Hunger Games. So initially what Katniss wants in that book is simply to save her sister. She volunteers as a tribute for no other purpose than to save her sister. So then once she's accomplished that, her goal then shifts and it becomes surviving. I hope I survive through the Hunger Games. And it's through the course of that her goal shifts again, where her goal then becomes, I want it doesn't matter if I survive. What I want is to point out to the rest of the world that this is some pretty messed up shit where kids killing other kids for the amusement and entertainment of other people watching at home. So it becomes that moment of sort of revolution. So her want is evolving. So I think one of the things that you brought up, Leslie, that's great is don't feel that the want has to be the consistent all the way through. That can change and evolve. And yes, you are changing the train ticket to go back to John Truby's idea. Like you sold them, this is a ticket to London. But then you're like, well, we made it to London, so let's go someplace else, right? You can do that. You just are then, again, if you think of it as a journey, you have to convince them in some compelling way that the new destination is as good or better than where they thought they were going. So I buy that you want to save your sister. Okay, you save your sister. So we've kind of already reached that destination. Now you want to survive. That's pretty good. And again, really what that book is building to then is the decision that she makes that it's not about survival. And Katniss, I don't think there's many doubts. She would have won the Hunger Games. Like she was a better competitor than everyone else. And if at the very end of that book or at the movie where basically the government comes out and they say, yeah, we know we said you could win with your partner, PETA, but now we've changed the rules again and there can be only one. I don't think there's anyone who doubts she could have killed him like in 2 seconds. Like she was far superior than he was, but she had now surrendered to a larger, bigger goal, which was, I'm not going to do that. And if that means we both go out, then that's okay. And what you're hinting at, Leslie, with your ghost motivation is something I think is interesting that we'll talk about tonight, which is that idea that we have a goal. We know what our goal is. We know what we're doing. We know what we're pursuing. And we have a reason for pursuing that. So in your case, I want my wife to be happy. And I feel like that's the noble thing to want. Like I can see, like, I can imagine if I was dead and I wasn't getting a divorce, that I would want my husband to be happy, even if that meant that he was with someone else. But I can also imagine that there might be a part of me that didn't have that feeling, that felt conflicted, because it would be nice if he pined for me for the rest of his life. And I may not want to admit that to myself, because what does that say about me, that I would want someone that I care about to be unhappy so that I feel more loved or valued? Like that's not necessarily something. So I think, again, when we get into motivation, it's around, we have a clear reason that we're wanting to do something. And I 100% buy his motivation, and that feels honest and true to me. And I can also buy that there's a secret part of that he may not be willing to admit to himself at this point about, I have conflicted feelings on that. So that is what we're going to get into tonight. So hopefully everyone will be able to join us if they can. If not, I will be recording that. And I'm just going to do a quick check here because I think we are good on this. So for people to know that at the beginning of December, I am going to be switching my office hours to Wednesday morning. So it'll be the same next week again. But after that, I'm going to switch to Wednesday morning and Tuesday evening, just so people can keep track of me and all the things. So that is the plan. So I thought I'd just start it in December. So thank you, Natasha. Thank you for being also my lovely Vanna White, who was able to hold up all the sort of examples of things. It worked out perfectly. And to everyone else, lovely to see you all here. And I will hopefully see you again and go from there. All right, I'm stopping the recording. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.